1, 2, 3. 3 count 4.
Hello everyone, I am Be Better Gamer and welcome to Be Better Gamer Wrestling. This channel is dedicated to wrestling video games fueled by my love, passion, and obsession for them. I am playing WWF No Mercy. I am bringing you a Let's Play of WWF No Mercy, which I haven't done in quite a while. And if you remember, I almost forgot, we are almost done with the Women's Championship path. In this game, I have 2 more championship paths. So after a very long wait, I'm excited to bring to you the second to last path. And I am using a created wrestler in the game, Alundra Blayze, my very own Alundra Blayze, making her official debut on my channel, Be Better Gamer Wrestling. If you follow me on Twitch, I'm at twitch.tv/BeBetterGamer. You might have seen me playing WWF No Mercy, and you might have caught a glimpse of Alundra Blayze before this video went up. So that's why it's very important to follow me on Twitch, twitch.tv/BeBetterGamer. You can catch me playing the Aki games and other wrestling games. Right now, I'm going to be playing Fire Pro Wrestling D, which is the Fire Pro game that was released on the Dreamcast as we build up hype for Fire Pro Wrestling World. So please stop by on twitch.tv/BeBetterGamer when you get a chance. But let's get to it. This is the WWF Women's Championship path. I'm going to have to lose the first 2 matches and win the rest of the matches, but I'm very excited. I wanted, when I originally came up with the idea of doing the entire women's path, you know, the roster in WWF No Mercy is fairly limited in terms of the women wrestlers available, but you know, we went through the greatest hits already. We did Trish, we did Lita, we did Ivory, we did Chyna, and I wanted to go a little bit old school in terms of WWF women's wrestling. You know, I grew up with 90s WWF. That was the farthest back I can remember. Obviously, I did see some stuff from the 80s when I was a kid too that I had on VHS, but the very first female wrestler in WWF that I remember was Alundra Blayze. She would end up winning the WWF Women's Championship 3 times, and she recently got inducted into the Hall of Fame. Well, recently, 2015, 3 years ago. There I go, losing to Terry right away, just going for a strong grapple, Hurricanrana pin, hoping it gets reversed, and it does. So now Terry is the women's champion. But Alundra Blayze, you know, she started out in AWA wrestling under the name Madusa Michelli being her actual last name. And a lot of people might remember her mostly as being Madusa. I mean, she was only in WWF for a few years, and for her time before WWF and her time after WWF, she was known as Madusa. In AWA, she held the Women's Championship for almost a year, about 335 days, eventually losing the title to Wendy Richter, and that's a name that's going to come up quite a bit talking about women's wrestling in this era. And Wendy Richter had made her return to AWA after unceremoniously getting released by WWF after the very first WWF screw job. It wasn't Brett wasn't the first one. It was actually Wendy Richter, where she was in a match with Fabulous Moolah, who was under a mask. She was disguised as the Masked Spider Lady and stayed on top of her during a pin and took the title off of her. In the future, I would love to go into more detail about that incident as it relates to the Montreal Screwjob later, and as it relates to women's wrestling as a whole at the time. But that's who you know, Alundra Blayze lost the title to, Wendy Richter. She also managed Kurt Hennig and joined Diamond Dallas Page's stable, the Diamond Exchange, which featured Hennig and Bad Company, aka Pat Tanaka and Paul Diamond, later known as the Orient Express. If you don't know who some of these names are, obviously you probably know who Kurt Hennig is, Mr. Perfect, DDP, but Bad Company, Pat Tanaka, and Paul Diamond, known as the Orient Express in WWF. I bring them up because, again, this is 90s era, late 80s, early 90s era wrestling, the area I grew up with. So just doing a lot of research for this channel, I was getting a lot of fond memories. But after staying in AWA for about 3 years, she went to wrestle in Japan for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, signing a 3-year contract with them, and she was the first Gaijin, aka non-Japanese wrestler, to do so. To put that in perspective, the company was founded in 1968. and Madusa joined in 1989. So 21 years later, they finally gave a full-time contract to a non-Japanese wrestler. Obviously, they had a lot of non-Japanese wrestlers compete for the company, but they were never under a contract. So that was a big deal. And according to Madusa, Japan is where she like honed her craft and really became a great wrestler. At the time, AJW was the top Joshi women's wrestling promotion in Japan. And you know, every single Japanese female wrestling legend you can think of, Manami Toyota, Akira Hokuto, Asia Kong, Bull Nakano, Jaguar Yokota, Devil Masami, Dump Matsumoto, Chigusa Nagayo, Lioness Asuka, and we're going to get to some of those names in a bit, but pretty much all of them went through AJW at one point. Here I was also, by the way, skipping the bikini contest. Alundra Blayze would not approve of the bikini contest, but we're actually getting thrown into a four-way match, and I'm going to be able to show off some of the moveset that I have for Alundra as I try to eliminate every single one by myself. It's not impossible. It's very easy to do, actually. And, you know, going back to some of those names I just mentioned, I've mentioned them in other women's championship series, and I've briefly talked about the difference in quality between the WWF/WWE's women's division over the years compared to Japanese promotions like All Japan Wrestling. And that's why I wanted to do Madusa, because that's, I feel like, the best bridge between Japanese female wrestling and WWE, and to show the stark contrast between the two. And I would love to go even more in depth about these women and in this promotion and the history of AJW. And Fire Pro is actually the series I'm gonna want to do that, because with the Fire Pro Wrestling series, there was actually an exclusive licensed game using the All Japan Women's roster. 2 games released for the Super Nintendo: Fire Pro Women All-Star Dream Slam and Super Fire Pro Wrestling Queens Special. There was even a PC Engine game, which I've never played anything on the PC Engine, called Wrestling Universe Fire Pro Women Dome Super Female Big Battle. And then All Japan Women versus JWP, which had the All Japan Women's license as well as the Japan Women's Pro Wrestling license, a rival company that was around the same time as AJW. So, you know, stay tuned for that, either on YouTube or even on Twitch. You know, I already said on Twitch, you know, I stream other wrestling games. My goal eventually is to stream all the wrestling games on Twitch, but I would love to go more in depth about the Fire Pro Wrestling series. And with Japanese women's wrestling, I feel like the Fire Pro series is the best games to do that with. So stay tuned for that. I don't know when, sometime in the future, but you're hearing it here first. But after her time in Japan, you know, establishing her connection and rivalries with some of the most famous female wrestlers at that time and for the future, Madusa came to WCW. And I think that's probably where, if you're listening to this, if you've heard of Madusa before, that's probably where you probably saw her first. If you are a little bit older than me, you know, and you were watching WCW in 1991, I wouldn't start watching WCW until a few years later, like maybe 94, 95. But she joined Paulie Dangerously's, aka Paul Heyman, Dangerous Alliance stable, which was like a who's who. I mean, it had Rick Rude, Bobby Eaton, Arn Anderson, Larry Zbyszko, and Stunning Steve Austin, aka Stone Cold. The Dangerous Alliance also had its roots in AWA, where Heyman first originated the group, so that's probably where the connection came from for Heyman bringing in Madusa. Now, after spending several years as a wrestler and training in Japan, she was primarily a manager and valet for the group, and the group was a heel group. They were, you know, they were a bunch of bad guys, and Madusa, she was the baddest woman on the planet, you know what I mean? And she would often interfere in the matches and kick and beat up other male wrestlers. So think of like when Chyna was in WWF. That's exactly sort of like how Madusa was. Madusa was the enforcer. Like, you know, if you've seen Madusa, she's beautiful, but she's also like very intimidating because of her Japanese wrestling background, because you know when she gets in the ring, she can kick your head off, you know? So it was really cool that they had her as part of the Dangerous Alliance, but she didn't really wrestle a lot. Her most notable probably match at the time in WCW was against Paul Heyman. They had a little bit of a falling out when the Dangerous Alliance was kind of falling apart. And they wrestled at a match at Clash of the Champions 21. It was supposed to be like a 5-minute match. That was the time limit. And Heyman just ran from her the whole match. Obviously, Heyman's not a wrestler. But the crowd was super into it. They wanted to see Madusa beat the crap out of Heyman. But that's pretty much it for her run in WCW at the time. And then in 1993, WWF decided they wanted to reactivate the WWF Women's Championship and the women's division that had been dormant for a few years. And Madusa was brought in to become the new champion, and they established that after a small tournament. She defeated Hailey Lee Morgan in the finals, and the last person actually to hold the title before Madusa was Rockin' Robin, who won the title from Sensational Sherry, one of my other favorite managers slash wrestlers, in 1998, and she defended the title until about 1990 when she left WWF. So when Madusa came in, her name was changed to Alundra Blayze. And the thing about Blayze, you know, looking back on it, she was treated like a major star. She always had like unique entrances and outfits for each major event, and her women title matches, although they were like scattered and spread out through the pay-per-views and TV, they were always featured as a highlight. And you can see, even at the time, as Blayze started appearing more on TV and pay-per-view, fans' reactions started to grow and get excited. And you know, with the women she was wrestling with, not a lot of the women, with the exception of maybe the Japanese wrestlers that came in, and we'll get to that in a bit, were probably on her level. But I think the fans, just looking back on it, the fans were like intrigued because these were women wrestling. You know, it wasn't like how it would be flash forward, you know, 7-8 years later, when we had the Sables and the Sunnies and things like that. But you know, it was still behind the time. It was still very behind the time, and we'll get into that. Why that was. But her first major moment in WWF would have to be defending the Women's Championship against Leilani Kai at WrestleMania 10. If you don't know who Leilani Kai is, she was actually part of the very first WrestleMania. She was involved in a feud with Wendy Richter, which involved Fabulous Moolah, Cyndi Lauper, and was billed as part of the Rock and Wrestling connection. It was a big deal around the first WrestleMania. And this actually match at WrestleMania 10 with Alundra was the first women's match since WrestleMania 2, when Moolah defended the Women's Championship against Velvet McIntyre. So it was quite a while, 8 WrestleManias until we got another women's match and a women's championship match even. WWF actually, though, seemed generally interested in making their women's division at the time be an attraction, not like how they would later on with the Divas division, but focus on real women's wrestlers, almost like how they're doing now, but on a smaller scale back then. And I think, knowing Blayze's work in Japan, they asked her to bring in talent to work with as women's champion. So her first real major feud in the WWF was against Bull Nakano, who Alundra brought over from Japan, and she was a major All-Japan women's wrestling star. Quick interlude though, this is really interesting in this women's championship path. I'm going to have to do the Royal Rumble. I'm going to have to do a Royal Rumble as part of the storyline. Obviously, we all know the few female entrants in the Royal Rumble: Chyna, Beth Phoenix, I said that so wrong. Beth Phoenix, and Awesome Kong, or Karma, if you will. But now we have Alundra in our fantasy Royal Rumble, and the stipulation for this, you see the stipulation pop up sometimes in the story mode where you gotta stay past 15, but I decide, you know what, I'm Alundra Blayze, I'm here to kick ass and take names, so you're gonna see me go through the entire Royal Rumble, so settle in for that. But it'll give me more time to talk extensively about her time in Japan, because I think that's really exciting. Or not her time in Japan, but the Japanese wrestlers that were brought over to WWF in the early 90s, because, you know, Bull Nakano was a big star, and she's a huge legend of Japanese wrestling, and I'm sure I'll be talking about her more in the future, especially when I do the Fire Pro games. And you got to remember, at this time, women's wrestling in Japan had been on fire for many years, and some of the best wrestling matches that, if you haven't seen it, they'll probably be the best wrestling matches that you'll ever see, and they took place in those promotions. As progressive as WWF might have been trying to be at that time, and even now, they have always realistically been behind the curve compared to Japanese women wrestling. It's not a coincidence that some of the most talented women even on today's roster, Asuka, Kairi Sane, and the incoming Io Shirai, hail from these major Japanese promotions. But their match, Bull Nakano and Madusa, or Alundra Blayze as we should call her now, because now we're in WWF. Their first match on Raw ended in a no contest, double count out. You can catch it on the network. Highly recommend watching it. And that would lead into a championship match at SummerSlam '94. Definitely watch this match just to give you a little taste of what these women were doing in Japan. They have a very Japanese style match, even with the flower ceremony in the beginning. And also, while you're there, if you're watching SummerSlam '94, make sure you watch Owen and Brett steel cage match at the end. One of my favorite matches ever. And you know, in the outfit there, also I should mention, her outfit at SummerSlam was sort of the basis of my call design, but her hair is actually matching like some of her other matches, because you can't really do a good ponytail with the women for some reason in No Mercy. It makes no sense, even though you can give the men a ponytail. I don't know, I don't get it. I'll get into more detail when I upload a call video for Alundra Blayze, which will be coming soon. But Blayze, Nakano, SummerSlam '94, highly recommend watching that, especially if you've never seen Bull Nakano or any other famous Japanese female wrestler from the 80s, 90s. It'll give you a little taste, and I'm sure you'll want to seek out a lot of their other stuff. Blayze would retain, spoilers, but their feud would continue for the next few months, and even carrying back over to Japan. And this is not something I knew back in the day. This is something I learned later on. Obviously, as a kid, you know, I didn't really have much exposure to Japanese wrestling, so I didn't really know who Bull Nakano was at the time. But a few months later, after SummerSlam, on November 20th, 1994, All Japan's Women's Pro Wrestling held an event at the Tokyo Dome. Yes, that Tokyo Dome. You know, if you watch New Japan, where Wrestle Kingdom is held every year. And it was called the Big Egg Wrestling Universe. It actually had kind of like a longer name too. And the Big Egg, the reason why it's called the Big Egg is because that's the nickname for the Tokyo Dome, because they think it looks like an egg, a giant egg. At least I think that is. I mean, it does kind of look like an egg. The attendance for that event was over 32,000. Some claim even in the 40,000 range. So if you want to talk about WWE evolution, if you want to talk about, you know, this is 1994, all right? To put it into further perspective, SummerSlam '94 was at the United Center in Chicago, Illinois, and the attendance was around 23,000. Compare that to this women's wrestling event in Japan from the top major Joshi promotion, 32,000, possibly more. Evolution, the upcoming WWE event in October, I believe, will be at the Nassau Coliseum, the famous Nassau Coliseum, which I believe holds a little less than 20,000. And it wasn't just All Japan women that were at the event. There were many representatives from various other Joshi events. It was like a major tournament between top stars from different promotion, a lot of belts on the line from different promotions. It was one of the biggest women's wrestling events at the time in Japan. It lasted almost 10 hours, which I don't even know how that's possible, but it did. Nakano versus Blayze was the semi-main event. It was the semi-main event in front of 32,000 people. And Nakano would win the championship in her home country. Blayze's run, her first run with the women's championship, lasted 342 days. The next longest reign after that run would be Trish's 6th reign, which I've talked about in the Trish Stratus Let's Play, at 448 days. And also, I'm going to bring this up because we'll talk about these people later. The main event of the Big A wrestling event was Akira Hokuto versus AJ Kong. And it was the tournament final, the V Top 5 tournament final. There are some excellent matches from this event, so definitely go check it out if you've never seen it. I'm sure I'll talk about this event in the future. But now Blayze, she would chase after the title, and she would win the belt back from Nakano on an episode of Raw. Okay, we went from SummerSlam to Raw, and she wins the title, which aired on April 3rd, 1995. That's several months later. What's interesting about this is that, you know, and the whole Alundra Nakano feud in WWF is that after their match at the Big Egg, you know, they both get interviewed, they both cut promos, and Blayze cuts a really nice promo, but she says that at the next WWE event, the next WWF event, if it's not Survivor Series, then WrestleMania, she's going to get her title. Well, they missed out on both. They missed out on both. Nakano only had one title defense before facing Alundra again, and it was in Japan against Kyoko Inoue at AJW Wrestling Queendom 1995. The next Women's Championship match at WrestleMania wouldn't be until WrestleMania 15 when Sable defeated Tori. So you would think, having Alundra coming in at WrestleMania 10, you'd think you'd see her at WrestleMania 11, right? Nope. And especially if she was going to win the championship in April from Nakano. Why not just put that at WrestleMania? Nope. I also did a fantasy booking episode on WrestleMania 15, so check that out to see my thoughts on the Sable-Tori match and what I did with that, as well as the wrestling event on my channel. WrestleMania 2000, fantasy booking, another Aki game, WrestleMania 2000. So yeah, you know, Alundra Blayze was expecting big things, to go back, have this big return match at Survivor Series or maybe WrestleMania, saying it in her promo, and it never happened. It never happened. It happened on an episode of Raw, and I still recommend you seeing that match. It's a good match, but it's a short match, and it's not on quite the scale as even their SummerSlam match, or even definitely the Big Egg Universe match, which Alundra had a spectacular entrance for. But her second reign would have even more limited TV show appearances. Most of her work would be done at house shows and non-TV tapings, but her next major pay-per-view match would be defending the title against Bertha Faye at SummerSlam 95. Now Faye, I didn't really know too much about her at the time, so I had to do some research. Faye was a Canadian wrestler who traveled all over the world, also having wrestled in Japan. She was also the very first Stampede Championship Wrestling Women's Champion, although there's some, you know, not confusion, but allowances made for her to do so because of the storyline. But in WWF, she was a comedy act, being paired alongside Harvey Whippleman, who was always like a returning comedy actor in WWF at the time. Faye's run would last about under 2 months until Alundra Blayze would get the title back on another episode of Raw 132, which aired on October 23rd, 1995. And then we would get to Survivor Series 95, which would end up being the last major pay-per-view appearance for Blayze. So we go from WrestleMania to SummerSlam, and then SummerSlam again, and then Survivor Series. You wouldn't have known it if you didn't follow Japanese wrestling at the time, and I didn't know it either, honestly, because again, I was 9 years old at the time, so I didn't know. I wouldn't find out about Japanese wrestling until a few years later. But this match had like sort of a who's who of like the current Joshi stars at the time and future ones. It was Alundra Blayze leading a team of Chaparita Asari, Kyoko Inoue, Saki Hasegawa against Bertha Faye's team. Bertha Faye was supposed to be the leader of this team, but it had Asia Kong, Lioness Asuka, and Tomoko Watanabe. Like, if you're a fan of Joshi wrestling, Japanese female pro wrestling, I'm sure you recognize some of those names. If not, you have to seek out some of these women. They are legends, absolute legends. This match is fun and exciting. It's quick, it's fast, but it's fun and exciting to watch. With the exception of Hasegawa and Bertha K, obviously, each of these women competed at the Big Egg wrestling event, which Asia Kong main evented, and again, she's on Bertha Faye's team. Lioness Asuka, Asia Kong, Kyoko Inoue, Tomoko Watanabe have all held AJW championship in their career, some multiple times. Asari, she never held the AJW main championship, but she's also a very decorated tag and junior champion from AJW. This was the first all-women Survivor Series match since 1987, which was the very first Survivor Series. Excuse me. That match had the Fabulous Moolah, the Jumping Bomb Angels, which was Itsuki Yamazaki and Noroyu Tatano, Rockin' Robin and Velvet McIntyre against Dawn Marie, very young Dawn Marie, Donna Cristanello, the Glamour Girls, and Sensational Sherry. And the Glamour Girls were Leilani Kai and Judy Martin. So some of the more recognizable names of women's wrestling at the time in WWF, late 80s. They were in that very first Survivor Series match, but this was the second one since that. And it would be the only Women's Survivor Series match until Survivor Series 2008, which was 13 years later, where they had Team Raw, which consisted of Beth Phoenix, Candice Michelle, Jillian Hall, Kelly Kelly, and Mickie James. Not a bad team. With Santino Marella, bonus, against Team SmackDown, Maria Maurice, Michelle McCool, Natalia, and Victoria. Victoria, one of my favorites. There was a 10 women's Diva tag match at Survivor Series 2007, but it wasn't done in elimination style, so I don't count it as a Survivor Series elimination match. So 2008, 13 years later, crazy. Most of these women were at an event, again, with 32,000 people headlining the Tokyo Dome, top to bottom, pretty much all. I think there was like a couple of exhibition matches with men, but it was pretty much all women. And here's WWE taking these huge gaps just to have these 5-on-5 tag matches at Survivor Series 4. It's crazy. It's crazy to think about. And especially, you know, talking about No Mercy, talking about this era, it's crazy to think about that we never got a Survivor Series style elimination match with the Attitude Era women, with Lita, Trish, and all of them. You know what I mean? Like, that's just crazy to think about. But Blayze and Aja Kong were the last two survivors, with Kong getting the victory. And now that might have been confusing if you were a WWF fan, if you only watched, you know, Alundra Blayze and you thought all these other women were like kind of nobodies. But Aja Kong was the GOAT in Japan. She was not going to lose to Alundra Blayze. And it seemed like they were going to set up a feud, much like how they did with Bull Nakano. You can see Aja Kong and Alundra Blayze meet again in a tag match on Raw 137, which aired on November 27th, 1995, right after Survivor Series, pretty much, featuring Tokyo Watanabe and Kyoko Inoue again. Another fun match. But Blayze's time in WWF would be almost done after that. I mean, in just a few weeks, she'd be gone. Blayze's last match in WWE was not televised, and it was a dark match. And it was a women's championship defense against Lioness Asuka, which is available on the WWE Network. It's pretty cool. It's in like one of the hidden gem collections. Now, after this, after leaving WWF, this point in Blayze's career has been very well documented. Of course, talked about in WWE's own Alundra Blayze doc that's on the network. You can watch that. And Blayze has talked about it for many years, and various other people. WWE was struggling financially at the time, in the 90s, around this time. And to cut costs, one of the things they did was abandon the women's division and get rid of pretty much all the women's wrestlers that they had. Eric Bischoff, who was running WCW at the time, they were in the middle of this, you know, beginnings of this war with WWE, if you will, the Monday Night War, as we all will come to know it. Eric Bischoff contacted Blayze and offered her a contract with WCW. Blayze appeared on the December 18th episode of Nitro, where she infamously dropped the WWF Women's Championship in the trash and returned to using her name Madusa. This was a fascinating moment in the whole WCW WWF Monday Night Wars, and especially at that time, you know, having championships appear in other promotions was a big no-no. But a lot of people have done it. A lot of men especially have done it. Shane Douglas did it with the ECW title. When he won the NWA title, he threw it down on the ground. Ric Flair showed up in WWF with the WCW title, calling himself the real world's champion. There's been various times that it's happened, but unfortunately, because of this incident, Madusa, she became blacklisted by WWF for pretty much the rest of her career, until she was inducted into the Hall of Fame. And, you know, I won't go into too much detail about the backstage politics and the other things involved with this issue. There's a lot of information out there about it, and I highly recommend you seeking out. Madusa's been on podcasts. She's been very open about her time as a wrestler. Obviously, you have the WWE doc, but, you know, I highly recommend seeking all that stuff out. I think Madusa was also, like, she was on the Stone Cold podcast, I believe. She was on the Jim Ross podcast. Those episodes are really fascinating to hear her talk about that. But my big takeaway of it, you know, many years later, from really learning a lot about what was going on at the time between WCW and WWF, and I probably didn't realize this at the time. I definitely didn't realize this at the time. But my big takeaway from it now having all these years of wrestling experience and watching wrestling, was that, you know, Madusa's situation wasn't all that better when she was in WCW. If anything, it became worse. Not for lack of trying either, because, you know, there were brief attempts to rekindle her feud with Bull Nakano, where they had a pay-per-view match at Hog Wild 96. But most of their meetings were like relegated to Saturday night or very short matches. They did begin a tournament in WCW to help establish a women's championship after Madusa's return, very similar to what WWF did. There were 8 women involved in the tournament, or 8 women, you don't see I'm doing quotation marks, and it culminated at Starrcade 96. Akira Hokuto, again, bringing her name back up. Chigusa Nagayo, Kaora, I'm probably saying, I always say that name, I think it's Kaoru, I always say her name wrong. Miko Satomura and Sonoko Kato and Malia Hosaka, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing these names wrong. I can barely pronounce my own name sometimes. They were all involved with the tournament. Akira Hokuto, she would win the tournament against Madusa in the finals, but she actually completed twice in the tournament. She lost to Madusa in the first round, competing under her masked persona, Reina Habuki, which she used in Mexico. And she was actually CMLL champion at this time, and she was stripped of the title for her appearance, you know, under the mask and losing. So it's crazy. There's even more stuff to go on and talk about that. But all the women, pretty much, except for Malia, were representative of the Gaia promotion in Japan, another top Joshi women's promotion. And Nagayo, Kaoru, Kaura, I always say that wrong, I apologize, and Akira Hokuto, they made their names in AJW as well. You know, Nagayo was part of the legendary Crush Gals with Lioness Asuka, who we saw in WWF, you know, with Madusa. And Maiko Satomura, she's a Joshi legend in her own right now. She's going to be competing in this year's Mae Young Classic. So again, I can't emphasize enough going on YouTube and looking up these women. Some of them have some of the most famous matches in all of Japanese women wrestling. You won't be disappointed. But they had that tournament. A few months later, Madusa would get another chance, and she lost. Madusa would lose, but she would get another chance at the Women's Championship against Hokuto at Spring Stampede in a losing effort. Then she would face Luna Vachon at Slamboree, and Luna was in WCW at the time. And then after that, she would face Hokuto again at Great American Bash 97 in a title versus career match and lose. She would lose, and this, you know, blows my mind, because this is unexpected. It's like, you think that because of Madusa coming into the company, establishing the title, and having her chase it, but then they have her lose in a career-ending match. And then Hokuto went back to Japan, and Madusa did like one more match at a house show the next week, but the title was then vacated and forgotten about. And Madusa wouldn't be wrestling in WCW until 1999. She was still under contract. She didn't get fired. She didn't get released. She was still under contract when they made this title versus career match. Now, normally when they do that stuff, you know, the person goes away for a little bit. But, like, she went away, and then the entire women's division went away that they were trying to supposedly build up. You know, it's just so weird. They hired Madusa. They have her kill her foreseeable future with the WWF by trashing the title. They establish a tournament to seemingly build up a women's division around Madusa and her Japanese rival, very similar to what WWF did with her, but they have her lose the tournament and against the champion several times, and then in a career match, take her off TV for nearly 2 years. Welcome to WCW. You know what I mean? It's just like, why did you even bring her in? When she returned in 1999, things got even more weird, because it was WCW 1999. She was featured in like a bunch of low-level intergender matches that featured a lot of gimmicks. You know, Russo was writing at this time with Ed Ferrara. She became Cruiserweight champion at one point, defeating... I remember seeing that too. I remember I unfortunately watched WCW a lot at this time. I was still going back and forth between WCW and WWE. She defeated Evan Courageous. But this wasn't like your Rey Mysterio, Dean Malenko, Jericho Cruiserweight division in 1999. The Cruiserweight division was not that. She feuded with Courageous and Oklahoma who was an awful Jim Ross spoof character portrayed by Ed Ferrara, you know, who wasn't a wrestler. He was one of the lead writers with Vince Russo at the time. I mean, and if that's not enough, Oklahoma actually beat Madusa for the Cruiserweight title. Welcome to WCW 1999, Madusa. Like, again, they bring her back again for this. Man, it's tough, man. It was tough to go through and remember all this, because I remember seeing all this, but taking it into the full context of Madusa's career, it's just like, it's crazy. In her final few appearances in WCW, she did have a few traditional women's matches, but Madusa was very clearly the only women's wrestler around, and had been for some time. If you think WWF was behind the times of women wrestling for a long time, WCW was like in the Stone Age. Her last pay-per-view appearance and match in WCW was a Pittsburgh Plunge scaffold match, whatever that means. Pittsburgh Plunge scaffold match. I mean, obviously it's a scaffold match, but why Pittsburgh Plunge? Oh, I know, because Shane Douglas is in it. It was Shane Douglas and Tori Wilson against Madusa and Billy Kidman. Madusa was frustrated at this time, so she kind of left WCW. She felt like the women's division in WCW was going nowhere. It was focused on mainly TNA. And she left WCW and eventually retired in 2001. By that time, WCW had been bought by WWF, but the company had still blacklisted her. So her hopes of coming over, maybe like a Tori Wilson or Stacy Keibler, non-existent, because she was still blacklisted. And isn't that messed up? Isn't that messed up how Madusa was blacklisted from the company, but the idea for her to dump the title into the trash was Eric Bischoff's idea, yet he was never blacklisted from WWE, and he like enjoyed a healthy career afterwards, after WCW closed, as a major on-screen character in WWE. Think about that for a bit. And it's, you know, yeah, alright, I can already hear you, oh, but Eric Bischoff, he ran it, blah blah blah. No one else was blacklisted to the level that Madusa's was. For her, following a creative order, many guys on Raw, on SmackDown, did things that Vince asked them to do. Many guys on Nitro and Thunder did things that Bischoff asked them to do, and they never got in trouble for it, because it was always like, well, they were following Vince's orders, or they were following Bischoff's orders. But here, Madusa, she was frustrated, she was upset that WWF scrapped the division. So when Eric Bischoff was like, hey, why don't you have the title, right? Why don't we throw it in the trash? And she's like, yeah, sure, let's do it, you know, whatever, screw them. But done, her career is done. And then WCW doesn't even like make up for it by making her career even better or bigger in WCW. They just use that for shock factor, and there was a lot of things done for shock factor in WCW, but no one got blacklisted for it except Madusa. So really think about that, you know. And it's unfortunate, because looking back on Alundra Blayze's career, you know, it brings up so many conflicting emotions that I have about wrestling sometimes, and that's why I wanted to do the Women's Championship path, talk about these women, because specifically with promotions in WWF and WCW, you know, like Madusa, you have a woman who was trained and mentored by some of the best wrestlers, period, male or female, some of the best wrestlers ever on the planet in Japan. But because of the non-progressive views of women's wrestling at the time, you know, she wasn't fully allowed to develop as the American star that she should have been, female American star that she should have been. There was very clearly a glass ceiling in WWE and WCW for a lot of people, a lot of groups, minority groups, cultural groups, you know, size groups. Obviously the cruiserweights, there was very clearly a glass ceiling, but especially for women at the time. So like, you can't even say she was like ahead of her time, because honestly, women's wrestling at the time outside of WWE was drawing bigger audiences than WWE at the time. And so if she would have just stayed in Japan, she probably would have been another Joshi legend over there. But she wanted to come back to America because America's her home, and she wanted to bring over, as she's talked about in the past, she wanted to bring over that style. She wanted to make women's wrestling seen as important as it was in other parts of the world. And unfortunately, she was hit with women's wrestling being very much a novelty at the time, And, you know, the other pioneers that I've talked about, the other WWF pioneers that I've talked about, like China, like Trish, all sort of struggled in that way as well. And I've talked about that in my past episodes. So, like, I'm glad that WWE is finally trying to change their ways. But honestly, it's like long overdue, and they still have a lot of work to do. Things are obviously way better now for women in WWE than in Madusa's time. But it makes you wonder what could have been if WWE started their evolution when they had Blayze on the roster and had a host of other legendary Joshi wrestlers. You know I love doing fantasy scenarios on my channel on Twitch, so I guarantee you will see me bring up Alundra Blayze in the future when I do some of those fantasy things. But yeah, I think the best thing we can sort of do is, like, you know, hope that the direction that WWE is bringing women's wrestling, hope they're playing catch up, and I hope they just keep doing it. I hope 10 years from now it doesn't disappear again, because a lot of these women today, man, I would love to see Alundra Blayze go toe to toe with them. So who knows, maybe she might lace up the boots one more time. Maybe we'll see her in the next year's Women's Royal Rumble. But that's it for my WWF No Mercy Let's Play with Alundra Blayze. I hope you liked it. I hope it gave you some interest in Japanese women's pro wrestling. If it gave you some interest in Alundra Blayze, let me know what you think. Don't worry, my WWF No Mercy call for Alundra Blayze is on its way. I should be uploading it soon after I upload this video. While you wait for that, why not check out my other WWF No Mercy Let's Plays or my WWF No Mercy calls. Once again, I'm Be Better Gamer. You can find me on Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as Be Better Gamer. I kept it simple. So until next time, you know what to do. Keep watching all the wrestling. Thank you.